Hello, my name is Marlana Edwards, and I did my social justice project on the myth of racial democracy in Brazil and how it affects Afro-Brazilians. The concept of racial democracy in Brazil stems from the Atlantic slave trade. Contrary to popular belief, more enslaved Africans were imported to Brazil than to any other country in the Western Hemisphere. Over 5 million Africans were enslaved in Brazil. Today, Brazil is home to the largest amount of black people outside of West Africa. Over 53% of the Brazilian population identifies as black or pardo, which is mulatto. Although the Atlantic slave trade was outlawed in Brazil in 1831, European settlers in Brazil continued to buy and sell Africans illegally until 1851. The institution of slavery persisted in Brazil until 1888. But even once enslaved Africans became free by law, they were still oppressed by the Portuguese and by other Europeans who had settled in Brazil. The abolition of slavery in Brazil was a tedious endeavor. In 1871, the government in Brazil attempted to free both the children of enslaved African women, in addition to enslaved Africans over the age of 60. Most European slave owners in Brazil refused to abide by the aforementioned legislation, so although many Africans were free according to law, they were not free in fact, and were still working for European masters for no pay. When the whole institution of slavery was abolished in Brazil in 1888, there was no Reconstruction period. The government did not make an effort to integrate free blacks into Brazilian society. Free blacks were not allotted any property, provisions, land, livestock, or access to education. Newly freed slaves in Brazil did not receive any form of reparations. This perpetuated a classist society, where white Brazilians were wealthier and more educated, while black Brazilians had to recover from the effects of slavery. In 1891, the Brazilian government created a new constitution that established that only wealthy males could vote. This legislation prohibited black people from voting because most of the Afro-Brazilian population did not have access to education and resources that would allow them to become wealthy, such as their white counterparts. In the late 1800s, the Brazilian government also began to encourage European immigration to Brazil. Immediately after the abolition of slavery, the majority of the Brazilian population was African. The Brazilian government intended to whiten the Brazilian race by inviting German, Portuguese, and Italian immigrants to the country. By the 20th century, the Brazilian population consisted of three ethnic groups: indigenous Brazilians, Europeans, and Africans. All three ethnic groups lived in so-called harmony because, unlike the United States, Brazil never passed any segregation legislation. There was no Jim Crow era in Brazil. Because of the coexistence between all three ethnic groups, Brazilian society became known as a racial democracy. Racial democracy in Brazil is ultimately a myth. It allows the Brazilian government and society to blame the marginalization of black Brazilians on class differences and not on racism. Brazilian society accepts classism, not racism. The majority of poor people in Brazil happen to be black because they're the descendants of enslaved Africans, and they are still suffering from the effects of disenfranchisement and exclusion after slavery. For example, the Brazilian government attributes drug culture and violence in favelas to the fact that the residents of the favelas are lower class and living in poverty. But the people in the favelas are lower class and living in poverty because they are the descendants of enslaved Africans who had no rights and no access to education or jobs. And the Brazilian government continues to isolate these descendants and to silence them. Racial democracy in Brazil is a myth because racism in Brazil is still very prevalent. Afro-Brazilians are unemployed at higher rates than white Brazilians, and they make up the majority of the impoverished population in Brazil. Afro-Brazilians are about half the population, but their economic participation is only 20% of the GDP. Unemployment is 50% higher among Afro-Brazilians than among whites, and blacks who are employed earn less than half of what whites are earning. The movie Rhythmic Uprising shows the lack of jobs and resources in black communities like Bahia, Salvador, and Brazil. Black communities like Bahia are referred to as the periphery because they lie on the outskirts of big cities in Brazil and are neglected by Brazilian society and government. The children in these communities, like Bahia, do not have access to education, and members of these communities often turn to selling drugs in order to support their families. Racism also exists in Brazil because Afro-Brazilians have less access to education than white Brazilians. Half of all black Brazilians are illiterate, while less than 20% of whites are unable to read. Only 4% of Afro-Brazilians between the ages of 18 and 24 have attended university, compared to 12% of their white counterparts. The movie Rhythmic Uprising also explains that a middle-class child will most likely be white and will most likely have access to proper education, while a lower-class child will most likely be of African descent and will not have access to adequate education at all. Racial democracy in Brazil is also a myth because of the lack of social justice in black communities. Blatant police brutality against black Brazilians shows that Brazilian society often views black Brazilians as inferior and not worthy of justice and respect. Afro-Brazilians receive longer prison sentences than their white counterparts and are twice as susceptible and subject to police brutality than their white counterparts. The IPEA found that black people were at least twice as likely to be killed by the police than whites in cities like Rio de Janeiro. The situation of blacks in the criminal justice system in Brazil could be far worse than the data indicates. The Institution for Religious Studies, ISER, found that police homicides were twice as high as officially reported, and that in the majority of the cases investigated, which is 64%, the victims were shot in the back at close range. And most of the victims were of African descent. This kind of reminds me of the Mike Brown case in the United States, where Afro-Brazilians are not attacking police officers. The majority of them are not attacking police officers. The majority of them are not advancing towards police officers, but they're fleeing and they're still getting murdered and shot. And it just shows a lack of respect for black lives. The movie Favela Rising reveals the effects of police brutality on Afro-Brazilian communities. Favela Rising also exposes how the police officers in Brazil treat people living in favelas as if they are disposable. The police officers do not act professionally in black communities and often shoot innocent people and children without having to suffer any consequences. All of these issues prove that racial democracy in Brazil is a myth, because poverty, lack of education, and social injustice are directly related to race and racism and anti-blackness in Brazil. But Afro-Brazilians can ultimately combat the myth of racial democracy by acknowledging racial disparities within Brazil and by continuing to fight for affirmative action and equal pay and equal representation. They can also combat anti-blackness by returning to their roots and embracing African religions and traditions, which help to provide structure within black communities that the rest of Brazilian society tends to ignore. As shown in Rhythmic Uprising, practicing capoeira and other African traditions helps to strengthen black communities. The movie Favela Rising illustrates how programs like Grupo Cultural Afro Reggae, GCAR, help to protect Afro-Brazilian children from violence and police brutality by connecting them to their African roots. Also, the expediency of culture explains how music, like Afro Reggae and African religion, help Afro-Brazilians to fight erasure and to advocate for representation within Brazilian society. Thank you.